60% of Americans have at least one chronic condition. And that continues to rise, and the number of people with multiple chronic conditions is continuing to rise. So we've got to do something about that. So let me tell you a little root cause story, and we're going to start right here. Slide 17. And let me just make sure I'm monitoring things. So this friend of mine and I, we go on a lot of bike tours in East Tennessee, and I never realized when I moved down here how fantastic the roads would be. We go down these bucolic farm roads for miles, and nary a car passes us. But every once in a while, we cross a little strip of pavement that's very rough. Some of the roads are rough in general, but we're going down a smooth road, and all of a sudden, there's just a little small swath, maybe 10, 15 feet wide, where it's rough. Okay? So here's what took me a while to figure this one out, and I didn't figure it out until I was talking about proper digestion. And last week we talked about grit. You know, no one's getting grit anymore. So here's a couple shriveled up carrots from the farm ministry that I'm part of called Renovatus. And you can see there's a fair amount of grit on that carrot compared to the store-bought carrot. And I'm not going to wash it off. I'm going to eat it just as is. As a matter of fact, this is the 4th of 5 that I'm working on this morning. We're now noontime for breakfast. So as we're going by these little patches of very rough pavement, the pavement is being etched or worn away. It's being broken up, okay, like this. And then I realized every place there was like a little gravel road or driveway or something like that with a little slope. So what's happening is in the water, when the rain comes, a little of this gravel is washing onto the road. But it's not the gravel itself that's etching away at the pavement. Vehicles are now going over that gravel and causing it to grind into the pavement, creating the rough patch. So it just shows you that a little gravel can, over time, gradually wear down and digest, if you will, digest pavement. That's what it's doing. That's why I think we need to have more grit. And Dr. Carter, if he jumps on today, did some research, and there are bentonite clay supplements that you can take. I don't think that's probably the ideal thing, but they do exist. And I just read a paper this morning, and I'm not going to go over it in detail, but I will blog about it. It'll be a topic. But basically, the University of Chicago did a big study on the history of eating dirt, and they looked at a variety of different reasons and excluded them. And basically, the conclusion they came to was that people who consumed grit historically did it for digestive reasons. They had poor digestion or gastrointestinal upset. And that's the conclusion, looking at many, many, many different factors, like being mineral deficient. Did they crave it because they were mineral deficient? And they did interesting studies to show that wasn't the case, but it seemed to be related to digestion problems. So anyway, you know, I'm repeating this message time and time again because it takes a while to take a new concept that seems, you know, archaic based on modern practices, but actually may be related to our health. So it's just one of those things that I'm harping on. It's not the only thing, but this ties into it. You know, we live in a developed world. We believe the food supply is superior, and in some ways it is. Supply is superior. I mean, no one has to worry about where the next meal's coming from. No question about that. But when it comes to nutrient density, it's less than optimal, especially in regards to mineral content. In the last 50 years, there's been an unprecedented change in how our food is grown, stored, and sold. This change has enabled us to have cherries from the U.S. in the middle of winter, and whatever that is, what's that word? I don't even know what that is.
Lychees.
Lychees? Is that a green vegetable?
No, it's a fruit.
It's a fruit.
Yeah.
Oh, I've been cloistered. I got to get out there.
Nuts.
Lychee nuts, okay. Why couldn't they have picked something I knew? So anyway, That's the point. In Europe and most parts of the world, it's acknowledged that our soils have become depleted in many vital minerals. I mentioned a University of Michigan study last week where they said, no, there's not a mineral deficiency. And they argued against this discussion, but they're only looking at the minerals that are in fertilizers. So sure, if you throw those on the soil, I can put selection bias in and I say, I'm going to just check for calcium and I throw calcium on the ground and then test it. It's going to be positive. So this this is a really interesting chart where we look at the decline in phosphorus, selenium, copper, and magnesium. And we've had tests that it's interesting. The tests in chemistry, they're called digestions. You do a digestion of the sample and then measure for it. We've been able to test for minerals for a long, long time. Now we have really fancy automated systems, atomic absorption. You take a little sample, you put it in there. Every mineral has its own absorption profile, fingerprint, boom, you have the data. So, and then we have different liquid chromatography so we can separate things very, very quickly. So what I want to get to now, we talked very briefly about this fertile model. Of course, now we have the canal and we have the dam, so we don't have this anymore. But for years and years, it was not just the lake water, but the floods were so significant that it was washing a lot of the soils and sediment in the lake down the river. And where I live here, we've had a very, very dry summer. And then we got torrential rains, and the rivers are all brown because they just churned up the soil. It's been dry for so long. They just turned up that surface layer and flooded it. And we've had such a flood runoff pulling the soils in. So that water has a lot of nutrients in it. And then, of course, our problem is that everywhere we're farming, and I don't have California, but they're up in the Sierra Nevadas, so there's obviously a huge flow of runoff from these desert mountain areas into the Pacific Ocean. So it's going to be a similar drainage thing. So we're losing topsoil, well documented, and we're losing just general nutrient content just through leaching. So I want to go into what minerals do. What minerals do. So minerals play multiple important roles. So it's not just, you need a little calcium for your bones to be strong, to bind into your bones. They do some very, very specific things based on some really interesting chemistry. And believe me, we're not going to go into the chemistry, but we'll talk about that. But they're used to create vitamins. They're used to prevent toxicity. And they're used to build enzymes, which without an enzyme, we would burn up. When you burn something, like in your car, things get very, very hot. You're burning gasoline. You're taking a hydrocarbon with oxygen and producing carbon dioxide and water. And it's called an exothermic reaction. It gives off a lot of heat and energy. Well, even so, the gasoline is just sitting in your gas tank. It's not exploding, yet it has all this latent built up energy. So somewhere we have to activate that gasoline to burn. And what does it in a normal gasoline internal combustion engine is a spark plug. We need the spark to initiate the reaction. So what that means is every reaction has an activation barrier. Even if I take hydrogen and oxygen, which is in the shuttle, for example, as a liquid fuel, they combine to make water. There's nothing more stable than water. And there's nothing less stable than hydrogen and oxygen together almost, okay? But when they're together, they're not reacting. There's an activation barrier for that to happen. So every reaction has an activation barrier it has to get over. before it can go down to a new lower, more stable energy state. It's just like if I have a brick on my railing, it's not falling. I can activate it by pushing it over the edge of the railing and then it falls. And if I had it attached to a pulley or something, I could create work because there's energy there. Okay. So what enzymes do is just a physiological catalyst to lower the activation barrier so things can happen very efficiently. In our body, that has profound effects. First of all, it happens. Second of all, we're not putting so much excess work into making that thing happen. Things go very fluidly. So that's a very important role that minerals serve in terms of supporting enzymes. And I'll try not to bore you too much. But what minerals do. This is B12, a very important mineral tied to cognitive function, tied to the Krebs cycle, tied to so many different processes. In the middle of the center is something really toxic, cobalt. If you took cobalt, it would be pure cobalt. You wouldn't take much to kill you. But our body can take that little teeny bit of cobalt, an essential mineral. We don't produce it. We have to get it from food or supplements, hopefully food. But it gets grabbed by this big macromolecule, and suddenly, rather than being harmful, it's beneficial. And one thing B12 does is detoxify us from cyanide. Okay? So there's methylcobalamin and there's cyanocobalamin. Cyanocobalamin is B12 that is spent in terms of its ability to detoxify you from cyanide. Where does cyanide come from? A lot of foods. Apricot pits, for example, are concentrated in cyanide. But that, it's just around. Cyanide's a pretty interesting molecule. It's a combination of carbon and nitrogen, which are extremely prevalent in terms of raw materials in the Earth's crust. So cyanide is not impossible to be made. So that's one of the things that the mineral cobalt does to create this vitamin B12, and it detoxifies us. So, when I first was hearing about functional medicine years and years ago and detox pathways, it's like, what's detox? But now I realize, we're an engine just like everything else. We create waste. We have to remove it. And there's all kinds of other things in our systems that create waste. And we get sick, we produce a particularly large amount of waste. That's why our kidneys have like 5x overproduction capacity or over filtering capacity compared to, when we're normally just living healthily and our kidneys are functioning. But when we're sick, that capacity gets used up to some extent. So now we kind of get the idea about how important minerals are in terms of making the vitamin work. Without the cobalt in the middle, it's not B12. Okay, it doesn't have any efficacy. But we're still having to build up this molecule. That's why I talked about Maynard Murray. We'll get to him again in a minute. So toxicity. So vitamin C will grab lead, for example. But how does lead actually create poisoning? Okay, everything's electrical energy. So what lead does is lead. Let's see if I have an image. Yeah, well, we'll talk about it in this. Well, we'll talk about it in the context of this vitamin. Lead can get into the middle here and displace cobalt. It's not that likely to displace cobalt because everything has to do with size and charge. It's called ionic radius. So if I have something little teeny weeny with very strong charge, that's going to be very strong in the middle of something. Then I can have something very large with a weak charge and everything in between. So when you look at, but the size of the mineral coupled to the charge is what we call ionic radius. So the ionic radius of lead and the ionic radius of molybdenum are very similar. So let's just say this was some cofactor mineral that used molybdenum and it did some vital function in our body, and then we have excess lead around. There's a possibility that the lead can get in here and displace the molybdenum. And when it does that, this molecule is now electrically very different. Okay, so the effect it's exerting on our physiology is not what was intended. This is what was intended, but this is what we're getting, and this may be toxic, or this is what we're getting, and this may be insufficient to have processes proceed forward. So the lead interferes with it. So that's how minerals can actually detoxify. So if you're insufficient in molybdenum, for example, then there's greater opportunity for lead to exert its toxic effect through getting into one of these vitamin or mineral or cofactor centers. Is that as clear as mud? You didn't realize you were going to be in a chemistry class today. I apologize, Everybody gets an A, though, because attendance is 99 and then only 1% for your retention. So don't worry about it. So did I ever tell you guys that I used to teach chemistry, but I did it as an adjunct, and I taught chemistry for non-science majors? And I'd come to that class, and the kids are like, oh, God, chemistry. I don't know why I got in chemistry, but I couldn't take, just physical science. And I explained to them Gartner's 7 different types of intelligence. And I said, in academia, we only measure 2. We're not measuring the creative and the different components of intelligence. So, and in chemistry, we're really focusing on those 2. So if you do poorly in chemistry, don't look down on yourself. It doesn't mean you're not intelligent. It just doesn't, you're not weighted in that level of intelligence. So I don't want anybody to feel bad for themselves. But then I always had to add, but if you do poorly in my class, you will fail. I couldn't leave that out. So enzymes lower the energy required for things to happen so they can happen very efficiently and fluidly. And the mineral in the middle of this enzyme has a profound effect on the enzyme's function in general for 2 reasons. Number 1, that ionic radius, the charge, but number 2, how it forces this big molecule to conform to a specific shape. It's literally a template for the formation of what it's trying to produce. So it fits into a nice clean box. Okay, and it's formed correctly. Okay, so that's what the enzymes do. They lower the activation by creating a nice little fitting template, and they give it just the right amount of push based on this little guy in the middle here. And that's how it all goes together. But what does this look like in the macroscopic world? It's pretty simple. Believe me, subsequent discussions we have are not going to go into this level of depth, but I thought from mineral depletion and stuff, I thought I'd give people sort of a more granular feeling for how these things are important. It's not, and then we look at things like, I just read a study this weekend, how vitamin D levels don't improve depression by some Harvard lady. And I had no choice but to write her a nasty note because her research stunk. They talked about high dose. In the standard of care, high dose is when they give someone, this is the standard of care, not functional. They give someone 50,000 IU. And then in this paper, high dose was 2,000. So it's 1/25 of what the standard of care considers high dose, and she's calling it high dose. And then they didn't even measure before and after vitamin D levels. It's like you can't make it up. So anyway, I had to write her a nasty note. So I'm sure we'll be great pen pals in the future. But anyway, getting back to minerals, is what minerals do is, we have DNA. That's the blueprint. Okay. And what the minerals do as part of becoming part of an enzyme is they're the carpenter and the tools to lower the activation barrier to making this plant. That's really what it's all about. Okay, so we talked about this briefly last time. I'll go over this just again. So, you're mineral deficient. So you just take a mineral. I am going to post in a few days Dr. Murray's patent with highlights in it just to show you. It's an old image. You can't even find it because it's 1963 or something like that. But it's really informative, and I think it's interesting. But what he says is there are instances of where the plant, even though seemingly healthy, is deficient in elements and gives rise to disease in animals. And what he's really talking about in a plant, you need the minerals to produce the vitamins. And then in humans, we need the plant to produce the vitamins. Many vitamins are not synthesized in our liver. They're called essential, and we have to get them from food. So if the plant doesn't have minerals, the plant is low in vitamins as well. And then when we eat them, we think of getting a nice green kale or something, but it's actually vitamin deficient, but it's also mineral deficient. So it's a double whammy. So let's see. Vitamin A and vitamin C were found in greater quantity in the sea salt crop. So I described that study where he took plots of land, didn't touch it, traditional fertilizer, sea salt solids, and he showed the plants were more pest resistant. They grew faster, and the animals that ate them did better, healthier, plumper, better eggs, more disease resistant, less mortality. So all kinds of good features. So the simple suggestions is, you can supplement. I'm not saying that's number one. Organically grown, grow your own. I guess they all get the same rating, 1, 1, and 1. Even having it's not about the big things, it's about the little things. So even having a little plot, a small plot, some garden plants, things like that will just increase your total vitamin and mineral content naturally. So, and particularly, I have some paranoid docs that are now plowing their backyards to grow plants because they're afraid of COVID. But it's not a bad idea anyway. Is there historical evidence that in the past, when the soils were richer, we did better from a chronic disease perspective? Because that's what we worry about. Decreasing early mortality, which means we increase health span. Okay, so here's a really interesting study, and the clicker says no. I blogged about this recently because I forget why it came up, but I just had no choice. But Paul Clayton is the author of this, and he and I are pen pals, and he wrote a book called Out of the Fire about inflammation. But he was at Oxford at the time. Now he's smartened up. He got out of England where the weather is dreary, and he lives in Miami and Provence in France. So that's a smart guy. So we know he's intelligent. But he worked with this forensics librarian. There's a name for her, but she went back into the medical records and looked at mortality statistics and disease statistics that were recorded in the British archives. And the British Medical Journal has been publishing for a long time, so they had data there. And what it said, it's important. Analysis of the mid-Victorians, 1870, reveals that life expectancy at age 5, I'll explain that, was as good or better than exists today, and the incidence of degenerative disease was 1/10 of ours. So let's first look at age 5. Antibiotics really didn't come into play until the 1950s. They were first available like 1947. So before that, diseases of adaptive immunity, a lot of viruses, infections, were very fatal. particularly to those who have poor adaptive immunity development. Infants to 0 to 5. And if you look at CDC statistics for influenza deaths, very different than COVID deaths, there's a very large risk of dying 0 to 5, and it goes down, and it doesn't go back up again until we get older. So back then, epidemics, TB, flu, other scourges were killing young people. And I used to live in this house in New Hampshire that had two very thick volumes, the Davis Farm, on the history of the town. And when you looked at it, the Davis Farm, the Davises had 10 children. Only 5 made it out of the 0 to 5 range. The rest died. So when you factor 0 to 5 mortality in longevity statistics, it's very skewed, 30, 40 years. But when you start at age 5 and start everybody at age 5 and look forward, these Brits in 1870 lived longer than British people living today, who live longer than Americans. And these people were not wealthy, they were poor. So how did they do it? And there's a couple clues on that image. Number one, they worked hard physically. The other thing they did is they grew their own food largely. You didn't have the supermarket. You didn't have the Piggly Wiggly like they have down south, and you didn't have the 7-Eleven like I have up north. So they raised and harvested chickens, for example. And guess what part of the chicken they didn't eat? Almost nothing. Almost nothing. They ate all the organ meat. They ate everything. Okay. And they preserved with salting. Salt's very important. You know, we need to have balance. We need to have potassium, but they use salt. Not a lot of refrigeration. They feasted and famined. So they did intermittent fasting. Okay. Because in that society, you know, when food was bountiful, you ate it. And we have this profound mechanism in our body called storage of fat, where we take excess sugar and convert it in the liver to long-chain fatty acids that can be stored. You know, read Laura Ingalls Wilder, The Long Winter. They survived on one potato. I can't remember exactly, but one potato a week for several people. They weren't surviving on the potato. They were surviving on their own fat. And that's obviously detrimental, you know, long term, but we're actually designed to feast and famine, not feast and famine 3 times a day, feast and famine, you know, on a much longer time domain. And that creates health. So these people were eating organ meat, working, you know, physically laboring, and fasting. And that's all kind of biblical. So that's why they lived so well and so long. Oh, I did a talk at the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine on what I call Back to the Future Medicine, and that'll be one of my slide decks at some point. But this was a very unusual decade in terms of historic records and proving that this is true. Okay, but before that, like the 1850 was the Great Potato Famine, and there was a lot of poor health just because of malnutrition, not only nutrition, but malcaloric intake. But in 1880, steamships became much more prolific, bigger, faster, better designed, and canning became a much more of a commodity rather than an art. So around 1880, these poor workers here, rather than growing their own food, had access to cheap processed food for the first time through canning and shipping. So that created sort of like the first processed food, and their health degraded significantly. So when you look at 1900 Brits, they were dying at around 60, not 80. Okay. So the French paradox. So the American Heart Association has demonized saturated fats for as long as what's the name of the guy? It's right in front of my face. Amy, you remember him? the guy who came up with the cholesterol theory. It'll come to me in a minute, but the point is, these guys, the French, on a pure per calorie basis, consume the highest percentage of saturated fats of any society. It's around 28-30%. America's down around 18-20%. Their cardiovascular mortality rate is second only to Korea, better than Japan. I have statistics on that somewhere. But so the point is, it's in the literature. It's called the French paradox. And the paradox is, why do 55 million people who take in high amounts of saturated fat have very low cardiovascular disease? And it's because saturated fats are protective. But they also do other things well. You know, they smoke at twice the rate of Americans, yet they still live 3 years longer and have much less heart disease. Why? Because although smoking is bad and creates an insult, they have better repair and recovery than we do. Okay, so you can take that smoking insult and it can be nullified by good repair and recovery. So what is wine? A fermented beverage. What are their cheeses? Fermented beverages. Their bread. When Jazzy and I went to Switzerland 2 years ago, we landed at the station in the Valais region of Switzerland after a long flight, a long car ride, a long flight, and a long train. Well, not so long train ride because the trains are so efficient there. But we craved bread because we very seldom eat bread. And it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I went to like 15 patisseries. One still had one little loaf of bread left because at 2 o'clock, they're all gone. And if they're not gone by that time, they're stale. It's a whole different gluten profile compared to Wonder Bread, that if I bought the Wonder Bread 2 years ago and brought it home, it would still be fresh. Okay? Fresh, full of preservatives and gluten. So the French are eating what could only be assessed as a healthier, more pure, whole food, unprocessed, and then unfrankenfooded. In other words, the bread doesn't look processed, but it is in America, whereas there, it really isn't. And by the way, we got that loaf of bread. It was a little crunchy, and we got some of that creamery butter from Switzerland.
Yeah.
And I turned butter into ice cream without doing anything to it. I just ate it straight up. But anyway, so that's the French paradox. You know, there's a French farm and there's an American farm. You know, the French obviously have to go with 55 million people. They have commercial agriculture too. But the people are a little more astute. A lot of the country people are really doing their own thing, doing their own gardening. Here's the other thing the French do. Can anybody identify that?
It's pate.
Mm-hmm. It's pate. Full of nutrients. Liver pate. I tell my wife I love liver. And she says, I love you too much to serve you liver, because every time I tell you it's going to be liver, you put this face on that makes me feel like I'm punishing you, so I'm not doing it. But, you know, I still quietly, you know, what we do is we take liver, we make meat sauce with it, so it's diluted, or, you know, cover it up in something, put liver in chili, put liver in tomato, in sauce. You know, there's all kinds of ways to take these things. I recently got duck, and their organs are extremely delicious, especially when you slather them in salt and duck fat. But anyway, I think that's all we're going to discuss for today. We're going to leave with a disgust. Oh, and actually I only have one more slide and on this one. And the other thing is, in 1909, if you measured omega-3 and omega-6 ratios, omega-6 comes from mainly processed food. It comes from plants, so there's nothing wrong with omega-6. But now with the corn syrup and all the plant-based processed foods that go into our food supply, all the corn. Look, every field you see north and west of me is covered with corn and soybean. Those are all omega-6s. So the food supply is, we have way too much omega-6. And part of the reason why we're seeing a lot of poor health is that in 1909, the omega-6, you need more of it, to omega-3 ratio was about 4-1, which is about right. And then in 1985, it was 25-1. And Dr. Trump, at the end of his career, was measuring people 40, 50-1. They're eating no fish, and they're eating all processed food. So omega-6s, this ratio is sort of a measure of systemic inflammation. It drives inflammation. Then you have an infection, infected teeth, or something like that. It's just adding insult to injury. So that's the other thing the French do. We'll talk about Weston Price. Almost every indigenous culture, when he went and visited them 100 years ago, had a very large percentage of sea protein and sea vegetables and sea components in their diet, most of which, particularly in the animals in particular, are very high in omega-3s. So my brain company, supplement with cod liver oil, magnesium, multi-mineral, vitamin D, organically grown. Add organ meats, seeds, nuts, and fermented foods. Grow your own patio plants. I use wood ash because I burn wood in the wintertime. I sprinkle that around my gardens to fertilize because it's full of the minerals. The minerals don't burn. So you take a tree that's been absorbing nutrients and has lots of minerals in it, and you burn it, and you get the concentrated minerals. And it also, the potash, it's a very good fertilizer if you don't use too much of it. So that will wrap it up for today. Was this, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, either through chat, private message, whatever, about the level of science here. This will be more sciencey than most, but hey, a health coach can tell you to eat more fish, or, if you're a vegan, use algae sources for your omega fatty acids. They can tell you to do that. I kind of want you to know why and get a basis for a basic understanding rather than just being told to do something. Hopefully this is a more sustainable approach. So with that, I will stop share. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to chat. Somebody privately, but told everybody, well, I guess no longer private, I enjoy the science. Good for you, Joanne, because I do too. Look, my brother-in-law went into finance and he's making millions. One of the smartest guys I ever met. But I'm not envious of his little, Learjet and all that, because he doesn't understand basic things about the world. And I think power of knowledge is much more powerful than the power of money. Although COVID might be proving us wrong. We'll see. But we still have the power. We still, people should not fear this if they understand what health is and how to make themselves healthy. So, any other questions?
Do you have a good resource such as a book or some other database that would be helpful with understanding more of this?
That's a really good question. I mean, I personally tend to read more research papers than I do books, although I have a few on my shelf. Let me think about that, Jan. I'm going to grab one. Sometimes you have to publish something because using a title. But this book goes much deeper than that. Some people have a problem with the Weston A. Price Foundation. But let me look, and I'll take suggestions from the audience. But they have a lot of recipes in here and a lot of ideas. And the reason why I consider them, the reason why I consider this valid is, I did a lot of it. Somewhere I have notes on all the different things. This may not be my original copy, but um, they say the number one superfood is cod liver oil. So when someone says that, I'm guessing that most of what else they're talking about is probably fairly credible. And I did read it, but it's been a while. But I think this is something that would be helpful for a lot of folks. But once again, I'm not much of a book reader. Like right now, I'm reading a book by Paul Ewald. If you saw my blog Plague Time, it's not like that's not light reading. That's like 4 pages, and then the sheep have gone away because I don't need them anymore. Um, but I'll make note of that and ask around if there's something that really covers it well. There are online summits now from Health Talks Online, and every one of them is free to listen to during a short period of time, a week. And then there's a lot of ebooks that go with that are short books. Like David Jockers is a chiro out of Athens, not Athens, Georgia, Ackworth, Georgia. And he bundles together really good little shorts.
Okay.
So like if you want to know how to intermittent fast, David Jockers' little 35-page ebook with not a lot of written words, a lot of images, a lot of suggestions is a great place to go. And these things are burgeoning now. A lot of people are publishing these shorts on specific topics that I find very helpful. If you want to read something that's comprehensive, it's going to be a little longer, but yeah, but great topic. And it's Health Talks Online. They're trying to sell you something. They're trying to sell you their subscription or a CD or something like that, but you don't have to buy it. You can just listen during the week, and there are expert talks going on all the time. I've been on a few of them. One of these days, I'm supposed to put myself on the list of available speakers. Everybody has sort of their slant and angle, so you have to kind of like they're expert talks, and so they'll be extraordinarily convincing in their topic area. But we got to figure out how to like. One of the things I'm hoping to help you do is create a better filter for what you need versus what they want you to want. I think a lot of supplements are good, but I think you can over supplement. For example, what do you really need? What are the things that are really missing? And so like that omega slide where we're at 25-1, I don't think there are too many people around America that are getting enough omega-3s compared to omega-6s, no matter how hard they try. So, from a non-supplemented diet. So that's why our number one supplement is cod liver oil, to give you the fish oils to circumvent that. So that would be high up on the list. Those kinds of things. So, but don't be afraid to ask that question again if I don't answer it well, or this wasn't adequate, or I don't do the research on it. Yeah, there should be a good summary book out there that covers things. But like I like Justin Marcagiani's YouTube channel, Just in Health. He covers things at a pretty good level and has some good information. Eric Berg, I think, chiropractor out of Washington, D.C., has a really great channel. And if it's not reading, you can certainly listen to his channel. So I read my papers, and then I listen to channels to the extent that I can. Dr. Carter's always pushing me to listen to more and read more, but I also have to do, so I don't always have the time to do it.
Yeah.
So
that's helpful.
Yeah, but I think intermittent fasting, when you look at age studies, Cynthia Kenyon out in UC San Francisco, I think, she put worms under calorie restricted environments, and they put animals under calorie restriction and in a bubble, and they always do better, but they're not resilient if you let them out. But I do believe that digestion is a very energy intensive process, and it creates waste as well. Like anything, it creates waste. So I do believe that, looking at David Jocker's thing on intermittent fasting is something, and organisms love excess sugar. But see, all the things they're doing on aging, to me, is only doing one thing metabolically. So like they talk about this stuff and they pontificate about the genes and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, what they're really doing is imparting insulin sensitivity to you. Insulin sensitivity. That's what all these things do. Intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, all these things. And it's an important thing, metabolic health. But if whatever you do to create an optimal insulin level is probably going to be the driver to help you achieve healthy longevity. That's just one, but metabolic is just one piece of the longevity health picture. But it's an important one. And the intermittent fasting improves insulin sensitivity, but also affords your system to catch up with detoxification. But now people have created cottage industries around that. What do you do before? What do you do after? And all those things are important. I think there's some valuable advice there. So, for example, if you intermittent fast and then end it with a big gulp soda, you probably have done more harm than if you didn't intermittent fast, because your system is so hungry for easily digestible calories that you'll get a huge surge in insulin at the end of that, and that'll offset any gains you might have made during that process. So I think the meal or the second meal, the first and second meal after a fast, is probably the most important one. So it should obviously be a meal of liver and fish. I'm just looking at faces. No, I'm big on not the Mediterranean diet per se, but like if and when I ever fast, it's a Greek salad with some smoked salmon or some pickled herring or something like that. That's usually it. I don't worry about the mercury in the fish. The omega-6 omega-3 ratio, I think, has a more of a profound effect on our health than mercury. We can detoxify, but the brain needs those omega-3s. Not everybody agrees with me there, by the way. Especially Mercola, who just interviewed me, and he's like, cod liver oil, the stuff you have is like, that's processed and it has mercury. It's like, oh. Joe, you've been out of the clinic too long. Yeah. Somebody says they eat pate. Very nice. Very nice. I mean, I'm going to get some peaches today, and I think I'm going to go get some pate now. Got to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Got to do it. Any other last questions? You get Mercola's krill oil, but you got to get your vitamin A too. Extremely important to eye health, and that's the problem with some of these, fish. Not the problem. I mean, they're just not. We've got to make sure we're getting vitamin A. Extraordinarily important supplement, and you can get liposomal liquid vitamin A.
Again, 8 o'clock.
If anybody gets a vitamin A supplement, feel free to send it to me, and I'll take a look at it, because it's not beta carotene. You've got to make sure you have the retinols. Vitamin A is a mixture. Very seldom is something in nature one single thing. All right, Jan.
I have to leave. Thank you. Thank you.
I've worn out my welcome. This will be up on YouTube. If the group got a blast from the last two I did, so this will be called session 3. And we'll talk to you again. How much A? I will GW. I don't know what GW is. What's GW? I'm not seeing it finished. You know, you got to be careful about vitamin A. I don't know the actual numbers, but it does have toxicity. That's why you look on Carlson's and look on the back label, and that's about the right amount of vitamin A on a daily basis. So that's what I go by. Maybe 2 times that amount is the most I would do. Whatever Carlson's is advertising in their cod liver oil, that's the vitamin A limit. All right, everybody. Thank you for participating, and we do a quasi-repeat tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock Eastern. Bye for now.